que é uma das publicações médicas internacionais de maior tradição e de mais alto impacto. Durante a pandemia que recentemente assolou o mundo, o BMJ foi um dos bastiões da defesa das evidências científicas na resposta à Covid-19 e de combate ao negacionismo e à desinformação. Naquele terrível período, tão recente, que não sai de nossas memórias, publicou diversos artigos sobre o Brasil e a América Latina, oferecendo seu espaço para que pesquisadores brasileiros denunciassem que a democracia, a saúde e a vida de milhões de pessoas estavam sob ameaça. Também foi um dos primeiros periódicos acadêmicos internacionais de alto impacto a publicar em 2023 artigos sobre a retomada das políticas públicas de saúde, assim como da democracia e da esperança no Brasil. Por dever de ofício e também na qualidade de coordenadora científica do Núcleo de Pesquisas Epidemiológicas em Nutrição e Saúde, o NUPENS da USP, o grupo de pesquisa que propôs a classificação nova de alimentos e que cunhou o termo alimentos ultraprocessados na literatura científica nacional e internacional e também no debate das políticas públicas, eu não poderia deixar de mencionar que foi o BMJ, o periódico que publicou em 2024 uma revisão guarda-chuva que apontou evidências consistentes sobre a associação de alimentos ultraprocessados com 32 problemas relacionados à saúde. As conferências de hoje, transmitidas ao vivo, em livre acesso, são uma oportunidade para que a comunidade científica brasileira conheça melhor o BMJ, também sua tradição, como seus planos para o futuro e como podemos participar deles. Agradecemos a disposição dos editores de vir aqui e dialogar diretamente com a nossa comunidade acadêmica. Mas esse evento também revela o aumento do interesse global pela América Latina, pois a presença dos editores aqui, na Universidade de São Paulo, se deve à recente criação de um conselho editorial para a região. Assim, abre-se a oportunidade de estreitarmos nossos laços com este periódico e, de forma geral, com o mundo das revistas médicas de alto impacto, em busca de formas de cooperação que levem em conta nossas singularidades e procurem minimizar as assimetrias existentes entre o mundo desenvolvido e os países do Sul Global. É simbólico que a primeira reunião presencial do Conselho Editorial do BMJ para a América Latina ocorra na Faculdade de Saúde Pública da Universidade de São Paulo. Neste conselho, além da tradicional presença da medicina, o campo da saúde coletiva brasileiro está representado por meio das 3 áreas tradicionais disciplinares: a epidemiologia, política e gestão em saúde e as ciências sociais e humanas aplicada à saúde pública. No mesmo sentido, o presente evento é uma parceria entre o Centro Observatório das Instituições Brasileiras, a Faculdade de Saúde Pública e a Faculdade de Medicina, especialmente por meio de seus programas de pós-graduação e centros de pesquisa voltados à saúde pública. Eventos como este são plataformas de circulação de ideias e de experiências, que geram a fertilização recíproca entre agentes e atores de diversos países, com origens disciplinares diversas, a fim de compreender a realidade complexa que vivemos e incidir sobre elas, na melhor tradição da saúde coletiva latino-americana. Sempre com o objetivo em comum de associar a experiência acadêmica à relevância social, em busca de um mundo mais justo e com mais saúde para todos e todas. Ditas essas palavras iniciais de boas-vindas, gostaria de apresentar a nossa agenda de trabalho nessa manhã. Teremos as 2 conferências, palestras dos editores da revista, que serão comentadas por nossos convidados especiais, 2 membros do Conselho Editorial do BMJ, Dr. Miguel O'Ryan, da Universidade do Chile, e a doutora Deisy Ventura, nossa colega, docente da Faculdade de Saúde Pública e também vice-diretora do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da Universidade de São Paulo. Somos a essa dupla professora, nossa querida professora, colega, professora Marcia Theresa Couto, chefe de Departamento de Medicina Preventiva da Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de São Paulo, e a minha colega querida, doutora Aylene Bousquat, professora da Faculdade de Saúde Pública e representante da área da saúde coletiva na CAPES, que avalia os programas de pós-graduação no Brasil. Então, vamos dar início com a palestra do Dr. Kamran Abbasi. The floor is yours.
Thank you for your very kind introduction, and most generous of you to host it and taking the time, and all of you for sparing the time today. We're very grateful and honored to be here. The last time I was in Brazil, Donald Trump was elected to the White House. Let's hope there's no similar disaster this time. Okay, so I might switch between my reading glasses and my glasses. So if I'm wearing my reading glasses, I might not see you if you want to interrupt or look, you know, what's he saying? But the advantage is that if you fall asleep, I won't notice. Okay, right. So I'm Kamran Abbasi, editor-in-chief of the BMJ, and I'm going to talk to you about our mission and what we're about, what we're trying to achieve at the BMJ. And my colleague, Jocalyn Clark, will go into more detail on some issues that I think you'll be very, very concerned about. But just to say, we're a little unusual at the BMJ, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute, in that neither of us are British, really, and we've both been the victims of colonialism by the British, and so it's rather strange that we're now running what was once called the British Medical Journal. But that's good. It's got to be a good thing. Right, let me try and move forward if I can do that. Okay, so a bit about myself. So the talk isn't all about myself, but here's some things about myself. I was born in Pakistan. This is Lahore, Pakistan, where I was born. And my parents are Muslim, but I was born in the United Christian Hospital. So I was already, you know, crossing boundaries at that stage when I was born. But it was a very good hospital in Lahore. And I came to, so half of my family is from Lahore, which is a big city, a bit like Sao Paulo, not quite as developed. The restaurants perhaps aren't quite as good as here, though Lahore is known for its food as well. And the other half of my family is from the north of Pakistan, which is the hills and the mountains. And this is our village, actually. It's developed quite a bit since I've been for a long time. The reason I show this is that when I used to go to my village when I was a child, there was no road. So you had to go up risking your life in a Jeep, or if you wanted to take several hours, you could walk. There was no running water. There was no electricity. If you needed basic health care, you had to, God knows, you had 2 days to get to see somebody. Yeah. My grandmother died when she was in her early 40s, looking like she was 80. And, you know, I just wonder whether if she'd had access to healthcare as we have access to healthcare, that might have not been the case. But what I also discovered was that the people who lived in our village were some of the happiest people you could ever come across. They had nothing, no water, no electricity, but they got the most out of life, enjoyment, talking to each other, being together, taking pleasure out of the small things. I moved to the UK, not on my own, with my parents, as an immigrant when I was 4 years old. So I'm an immigrant to the UK. And I didn't go to a private school and to an elite university. I went to a state school, it was a comprehensive school in Yorkshire, in the UK. And I went to Leeds University, which this is, to study medicine, largely because my parents told me to study medicine. I don't know whether that's a familiar trait here in Brazil and in South America, but if you're from South Asia, often your parents tell you what you should do in your life, and you just do what they say. And I thought, okay, you're fine, I'll do what you want. After that, I didn't do what they wanted me to do, but that's a different story altogether. But I went that far. I worked in various hospitals. The last job I did was working at a place called St. Bartholomew's Hospital. So I trained as an internal physician in internal medicine. I did something called the membership of the Royal College of Physicians. My last job was at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, working for somebody called Parveen Kumar. I don't know if anybody has read the medical textbook or used the medical textbook called Clinical Medicine. by Jocalyn Clark. Well, she was the author of that book. And I said, I'm leaving to join the BMJ. And he said, no, you mustn't do that. That'll be the end of your career. You'll ruin your career. Please don't do that. What a mistake. And now she laughs whenever I see her and says, look, I got that horribly wrong. But I did that. But the reason, how do you become a doctor and then get into journalism? So I know cricket is very popular in Brazil. It's your number one sport, isn't it? I've been here 48 hours, as I was saying yesterday. I haven't seen anybody talk about football, seen a football, watched any football on TV, seen a graffiti about football, anything about football. And I thought Brazil was the kind of the country for football. I used to support Brazil, I still do when I was a child, at football. Because Pakistan don't really have a football team. And I find it a bit hard to support the English team as an immigrant. But I was very passionate about cricket because as an immigrant, this was about the only thing my country, Pakistan, were good at. So I used to get very worked up about them doing well and beating England. And I sensed, I felt they were treated very badly by the English media because they were quite racist because they're from another country. And there was a whole colonial attitude towards the country of my birth. So I thought, I'm going to do something about this. I want to write. I'm going to do something. So luckily, and rather surprisingly, while I was a resident, a junior doctor, I also became a sports writer. So I was writing about cricket, going to international matches and reporting on them. It was really wonderful. And then when the opportunity came up at the BMJ, they thought, wow, this is unusual. He's a journalist already, so we'll give him a chance. So that was really fortunate for me that it turned out like that. And this is BMA House in London. It's one of the kind of pillars of the British medical establishment. And it was when I went for my job interview, I thought there's no chance I'm going to get this job. Born in Pakistan, immigrant, went to state school, but I thought I'd just go. And the editor at the time, who Jocelyn and I both worked with in our early days at BMJ, was somebody called Richard Smith, and he was a really amazing person. Still is, he's not dead, he's still very much alive, although he threatens to kind of disappear off the horizon now and then. But he wasn't bothered about any of that, and he appointed me, and it's really changed my life. During my time as an editor, I've also done other things. I was editor of the Bulletin of the World Health Organization for a while. I was seconded there and I relaunched the Bulletin. That was quite an exciting thing to do. I also edit something called the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, just to be open with you. And I'm a professor of public health and primary care at Imperial College. Only an honorary visiting professor, not a proper professor like some of the people in this room. So they're the things that I do. The BMJ has been around since 1840, not quite as old as the medical establishment here, but it's a long time. And we're owned by something called the British Medical Association, which is the medical association in the UK. But we're independent. We're entirely independent. So I'm editorially independent. What we do as an editorial team is absolutely independent of our owners, and they cannot tell me what to put in the BMJ. They sometimes try, and you can imagine how I react to that, and they don't like it. But we have people like Miguel and Deisy on our editorial board to back me up if anything happens. So we are independent. I'm an independent-minded person. We're an independent journal, which allows us to do the things that I'm about to tell you about. Now, the BMJ as a group, it's not just publishing. We have digital health and careers and learning. I want to produce better evidence, better decisions, better systems. That's all great, and improve health outcomes. And we really think a lot about, we call mission, people used to call it, we now call it purpose. And we think it's really important. And the person who talks more about our purpose than anybody else now is our chief executive. So whenever he stands up, he starts talking about our purpose. And then when I stand up, I feel I have to talk about the money, because I feel embarrassed. He hasn't spoken about the money. But we are a commercial organization as well. And we do make a profit in what we do, but we're owned by the BMA, and our profit goes to the BMA. But we try to marry, the purpose is what drives us. Our mission is what drives us as a journal. So that slide's got many elements. There's lots happening in our world of publishing. There's the rise of open science. Many of you will be aware of. There's a whole digital environment, social media, patients, the public, civil society, much more involved in health. That's fantastic. We want that. And of course, demographics are changing, aging population, chronic diseases, multimorbidity, etc. And now we're able to see how we do it. We're actually in a global world now, which is one of the reasons we're here. It's wonderful to be here and share and learn together with you. But the BMJ at its heart is a scientific journal. Okay, so the thing that makes us is the quality of the science we publish, our processes around that, the peer review processes, and that's why it's in the center. It's at the heart of what we do. But we're quite unusual in that, well, most journals will have research. They'll also have some education, but we also have a very high standard of journalism. So most journals will not have journalism. We have news, features, investigations, comment pieces in a way that no other journal has. And I think that's fantastic because it allows more people to read us, it allows more authors to publish with the BMJ. So, but at the end of the day, the science is at the heart of it, and that's what gives us our credibility. Oh, you want me to speak? What's that? Sorry, is it? Yeah. So we receive about 3,500. Perhaps I'll just hold the mic. We receive about 3,500 submissions annually. Okay. And we reject 90% of those without peer review. 90%. And about 10% are sent for peer review. And a small number each week are discussed at our manuscript meeting, which takes place every Thursday. Should be taking place just about now as we're speaking. And we end up publishing or accepting about 3 papers every week. So we publish 2 to 3% of research papers that we receive at the BMJ. How do we come to that decision? I could go into the, in many different ways, but just to give you a quick overview, we just start, at the heart of it is a very simple structure. Is the article interesting and relevant to our readers? If so, what's the research question? Is it original and important? If the question is original and important, we look at the methods. Are they the right methods to answer that question? Are they strong? Are they valid? And if all of that is true, we should be interested in publishing the paper. So we don't look at the results. We really focus in on the question to see if it's if it's an original important question and whether the methods are good methods to answer that. So I've simplified it massively, but that's essentially how we consider papers at the BMJ. This is the actual process. It's pretty complicated. There's lots of peer review, lots of editorial discussion, going to and back and forth. There are lots of editors look at papers. We have statisticians who look at the papers that we publish. But it's, I think it took me all day to explain that to you, and I won't bother. But the BMJ is at the heart. I said we have a group. We have many other journals. We have about 70 other journals. We have clinical decision support products. We have a careers jobs site for doctors and other health professionals in the UK. And we have events. I was at an event last week in Hong Kong called our Quality Forum. It's about quality and safety. Went very well. But the credibility of the BMJ and how much people trust the BMJ allows everything to happen. And what allows the BMJ to have credibility is how well we conduct our peer review, our science, and how people trust what we do. We don't always get it right. We get it wrong. We know that. But that's at the heart of the BMJ and our organization. So I think we actually lead journals in many different ways. And I'm going to explain to you what I mean by that. But it all comes down to values. And I'll get to what our purpose or mission is in a minute. But we're very values driven, okay? And I'm sure you have values in your organization. Our values are these: to be evidence-based, to be patient-centered, to be independent, courageous, unbiased, to be trusted, to be transparent, and therefore to be trusted, and to be proud of our people. And I'm going to give you some examples of how we make that happen. So when it comes to the science, we're the first journal really, other than PLOS, to demand mandatory data and code sharing for research that we publish in the BMJ. That's a policy we announced this year. So any research that you do, and there's some code that goes with your analysis, you have to make it publicly available. With a clinical trial, you have to now deposit your data or allow people access to your data so that they can look at it, scrutinize it if they wish to. And none of the other leading medical journals is doing that. So that's a real exercise in transparency combined with evidence-based medicine. We've worked with patients for over 20 years. We have 3 patient editors on our staff. We have patients reviewing our research papers. Patients and representatives of the public work with us on our different sections. No other journal does that. And we recently marked a 10-year anniversary of our patient and public partnership strategy. And we're going to continue. It's hard work, but we do stick at it. We also have zero tolerance for industry, for any commercial interests in our educational articles. So whether that's an education article or an editorial that's an education themed editorial, if somebody has in the last 3 years got ties with a commercial company or any kind of funding, then we will not allow them to publish or write an article for us. And again, there are 1 or 2 journals that do this as well, but none of the other leading journals do that. We embrace new methodologies. Okay, I know some of you would want us to embrace qualitative methods and other methodologies. Yes, we do. We're very open to different methodologies. But here's an example about AI. We published a statement about transparency around reporting of AI models. And so we want to be part of developing new methodologies and increasing the rigor that surrounds them. We also are brave. You know, all of that is brave, but this is brave. This is a test that the National Health Service in the UK is about to use, and it's undergoing it's in a trial at the moment. We had an investigation into this whole trial and the NHS's use of this product, and it was very critical. And just last week, we had letters from the trialists, who are very senior people in the UK, the government, the ethics committee, complaining about this, but we're standing by what we published, and there's nothing for us to change in the article. So we're not afraid of tackling authority. In fact, that we do that very well. Here's something I wrote in the pandemic. It's one of the reasons actually probably I'm here. Daisy and Leo, I was in touch with them when I wrote this around the time of that, because this was not just applicable in the UK. I'm sure it resonates with what happened in Brazil. So my argument in this piece was, in 2021, was that by politicians taking certain actions or not taking certain actions, they were effectively aiding and abetting the death of many poor and disadvantaged people. And to me, that was something called social murder. And if you're interested, read this editorial. It's not a phrase that I came up with, but it's a phrase somebody else came up with. But I think it applied in this particular situation. Many people didn't like that, of course, but I think it still stands true. We've done a lot on racism. Here's a theme issue on racism that was this led to the creation of a race and health observatory in the UK. It was a very big thing that happened as a result of this. And we regularly publish theme issues on the climate crisis, and we're very active in this area. One of the proudest things we do is produce collections and theme issues with our regional colleagues. And here we've done a couple in South Asia, which have been very, very successful. I even managed to publish an article, a research paper on cricket in one of these theme issues. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, it's a very famous paper in the annals of the BMJ. But, you know, we're very proud that we worked with Daisy and colleagues to produce this series of papers about, you know, Brazil and the G20, political context and decolonization of health. Very, very, very important. This region is so important. We want to work more with you and allow the BMJ to be a platform for all of you to improve the lives of people, you know, improve society, because that's fundamentally, and that's what I'm getting to, is what we're all about. We're very active when it comes to evidence-based medicine. We do innovative things. We work with these people who are called MAGIC, who produce rapid recommendations, and they also produce living systematic reviews. I think we're about the only leading medical journal that publishes living systematic reviews. For those who don't know what this is when you publish a systematic review, and then when a new trial comes along, you update it. You don't have to go through the full peer review process again. And they were very, very effective and useful during the pandemic. There's less of a need for them now, but they were very, very of the moment then. And we've tried to hold governments to account, you know, in relation to what happened during COVID. We've had papers on the UK's response. Actually, I wrote a submission on our behalf to the UK inquiry that's just going on at the moment, but we had a series of papers about this. We had these excellent set of papers that Jocalyn worked on with colleagues in Canada. She has a special interest in Canada, which is good. I've also done one on the USA as well. So perhaps we should look at what happened in this region. I don't know. That's for you to tell us. But we're in the middle of a whirlwind, okay? There's so much going on, and it kind of feels, you know, how do we control this? This is Charles Dickens, who's slightly controversial, one of England's greatest novelists. Some people accuse him of being a colonialist. I listened to podcasts where they were talking about this and saying, well, he had some colonial attitudes towards India. And another person on the podcast said, well, actually, they were informed by the misinformation that the British government was spreading in England. So he was going on secondhand misinformation. So as we know, these things are always so complex, and governments spread misinformation as much as anybody else. He was one of, you know, the Britain's greatest novelists. And he wrote in this book, not a very well read, very well known book, Barnaby Rudge, the demons of wrath and despair who've striven to emulate those who ride the whirlwind and direct the storm, and man lashed into madness with the roaring winds and boiling waters become for the time as wild and merciless as the elements themselves. I feel we're in those sort of times. Things are crazy, and there's a storm all around us like a whirlwind. But how do we direct it? We need to direct it some way. We need to control this. And I think the way to do it is to have a very clear vision of the world we want, the way we want the world to be. And our vision for that, the way we see that at the BMJ is that a better world is one that prioritizes outcomes related to health and well-being for people and the planet. And every single word there is very important. We want a better world. It's about people and planet. It's not just about people. It's about health and well-being. It's not just about health. And it's about outcomes related to health and well-being. And the point about that is, if you're interested in outcomes related to health and well-being, you know, and you know all too well here, and we know that the health sector is only responsible for 20 and at best 30% of those health outcomes. The rest is in education, transport, housing, how we feed people, everything else, the environment. And so if you're serious about improving people's lives, improving people's health and well-being, it's not just about the health sector. It's all about the other sectors as well. And we should be publishing on those sectors and getting actively involved. And the one word that I will also say is important here is prioritize this. I put that in deliberately. That is not just a word I put in there to fill the sentence out. That's a political statement. Because what I'm saying there is that outcomes related to health and well-being should be prioritized, not just by doctors, not just by health professionals, not just by the health sector, but by everybody, by politicians, ahead of GDP, ahead of financial economic growth. This is the most important thing that we should be fighting for. And if we have that as the priority, then prosperity and economic growth, if you want it to grow, will follow. But health and well-being for people and the planet is the number one thing that we should be caring about. And it's absolutely right for us as a medical journal to make that stand and to and to fight for that. And we will continue to fight for that. And I hope you agree with that with us. And the justification for it, if there's any need, if you look at the SDGs, WHO very helpfully came up with this figure, which put the good health and well-being SDG at the center and showed how all the other SDGs relate to health and well-being. And it's a really interesting figure, really useful. And that's, I think that, I didn't come up with that phrase because of the figure, but then I found this because it directly related to that phrase, the mission, the purpose that I've described to you. So this means that the BMJ has changed, right? We're not just about the health sector. In fact, if you go back to 1840, there wasn't much the health sector could do. A lot of what you read in the BMJ was people talking about social issues. And then everything became very, very medicalized. It remains medicalized, but we need to move away from that and think about the world around us and how that impacts on people's health and well-being outcomes. So if you accept that we need to be looking at broader issues, you also accept that actually, if we might publish a paper about education or housing or some other sector, then the methodological approaches there might not be the standard ones that we're used to. There might not be an RCT in a classical sense or a classical observational study. So we need to open our minds up to different methodologies and different methodological hierarchies. I learned from Deisy yesterday, different methodological landscapes, evidence landscapes. I like that phrase. I'm not quite sure what it means, and I hope she's going to explain it to me before I leave. But I think we need to think about things very differently and open up our minds. And my argument for this is that, you know, we've got AI, we've got machine learning, we've got all sorts of new ways of analyzing data. The BMJ, all of us, we should embrace those because they're not going away. And the example I give is that as a journal, we've been heavily involved with the conduct and reporting of randomized controlled trials for over 25 years. And that has improved the reporting and the conduct of randomized controlled trials in that time, because that means it's better for patients and the public. In the same way, we should be equally enthusiastic to be involved with the new methodologies and the more diverse methodologies that are around, because ultimately that will make their reporting and conduct better and also be better for patients and the public. We're primarily about doctors, but actually the statement that I give you, if you think about outcomes, then let's think about people in rural Brazil, rural South America, rural India, rural Africa, rural China. They may not have access to a doctor. Yeah, so if we're to improve their health and well-being outcomes, then it's going to take other health workers, community workers, other types of health professionals to also improve their health and well-being outcomes. So what the BMJ should be about, clearly we publish a lot for doctors, for public health professionals, for people working in our sector, but we should also be open to publishing content that will inform those people trying to serve rural, disadvantaged populations around the world. And this study in Science, I won't explain it. Well, I'll explain it, but I won't go into detail on it. It essentially showed that if you train non-medically trained people in some basic elements of medical care, they very quickly get up to the standard of providing a similar level of basic care as a doctor can. So it's not as good, but actually it's good enough to try and help those people who don't have access to the facilities that we might have elsewhere. And of course, we're in a very international world now. People often call me the editor of the British Medical Journal. I'm not that. I'm the editor of the BMJ. Okay, and as I said to some colleagues yesterday, the BMJ can now be whatever you want it to be. It can be the Brazilian Medical Journal, or the Buenos Aires Medical Journal, or the Baghdad Medical Journal. Whatever that B wants to be, you make it your own, because we're definitely not British in the sense that you might think we are. Yes, we're based in the UK. We have a readership to serve in the UK, but that's about 150,000 readers in the UK. Around the world, we reach 2 million every month, and that is growing again after the pandemic. We also need to use social media. Now, this man has been discredited. He's a comedian called Russell Brand, and he's been sexually harassing women. The reason I put this slide up is that before he was got into trouble for that, he used to occasionally, well, actually quite regularly, just get a BMJ article and read it out. Yeah. And if you looked at how many people read that BMJ article on bmj.com, it was probably a few thousand. He would get millions of people watching him read that article. So we've got this new issue to contend with this social media, the power of individuals. It's made me think perhaps I should read Editor's Choice YouTube every week, but I think I might not have the same attraction as somebody who's corrupt and, you know, discredited like him. But we're facing a whole new set of challenges around us. And journalism is changing, medical journalism is changing, because this is the New York Times published a report on how all publications need to respond to the digital environment. And it's a very good report. And some of that thinking goes into our digital transformation. So that's what we're trying to do, why we're changing, why we're developing in the way that we are. I want to talk to you a bit about evidence, okay? I mean, there's quite a lot here. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and skim through this. But the message essentially is that the BMJ has always been making the argument that there is a lot of poor medical scientific research. And this is Doug Altman, who's our leading statistician for many years before he died a few years ago. And back in 1994, I think the phrase at the top is the pertinent one. We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. And that still applies today, because we have too much information. This is something called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a famous poem where sailors are stuck on a boat not too far from here in the Atlantic, and they don't have any water on board. But of course, water is all around them, but they can't drink any. So the poem goes, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. And this man called Muir Gray, who's a public health doctor, applied that to say, as health professionals and doctors, we are overwhelmed by information, but can't find the information we need when we need it. And I think that remains very, very true. And that's described as the information paradox. I won't go into these problems with EBM things. I think we're short of time. But there are many issues with evidence-based medicine. I could perhaps share the slides afterwards for people. But before the pandemic, we said things needed to change. Yeah. And we produced a manifesto at the BMJ. We wanted to expand the role of patients, health professionals, and policymakers in research, increase the systematic use of existing evidence, make research evidence relevant, replicable, and accessible to end users, reduce, problematic research practices, come down harder on drug and device regulation, produce better clinical guidelines, support innovation, educate professionals better in evidence-based healthcare, and encourage the next leaders in evidence-based medicine, because we think it's the heart of clinical practice, public health practice, understanding evidence, whichever specialty you're in. If you're a historian, it's very, very, very important. This was before the pandemic. We had lots of problems. Now, what happened during the pandemic? This happened. We were suddenly inundated with submissions. So from 2019 onwards, the number of submissions we had almost doubled. There was so much information that was being shared and spread around the world. This is a preprint site. There was an exponential rise in submission of preprint. So if there was a problem with information before the pandemic, it suddenly multiplied massively afterwards. And so we're now trying to deal with this, and professionals were trying to deal with this. And I won't go into the pandemic. One of the things that we did do after the pandemic was publish a series of papers, our own inquiry into what went wrong during the pandemic in the UK, because the government wasn't doing it at the time. And there were one or two positives that came, there were a lot of negatives, one or two positives that came out of this. One was that health professionals created learning networks in the pandemic to learn from each other, to mobilize evidence for improvement. We thought that was a good thing. And they also created environments to generate new knowledge as well. And I guess you might have had that in Brazil as well. I'm not as close to what happened here in the rest of Latin America, but there were positives that came out of it, and people really adapted to the situation. But where this comes back to is that the problems with information aren't going to go away. And we're in the fourth industrial revolution, as described by this man, Eric Topol. And the fourth industrial revolution is all about artificial intelligence. And he's saying that even in 2016, medicine was behind the curve. I think none of us feel like that now. I think medicine is just inundated with artificial intelligence everywhere. And part of our problem now is, how do we work out what's useful, what's helpful, what's the evidence here? How do we know things actually work and improve patient outcomes. And there's lots to be done beyond finding examples of AI. And I know you have very sophisticated use of AI in some of your hospitals here, such as the Einstein. But, you know, Bill Gates thinks it's a really, it's the most important development ever. And, you know, we're in the middle of the next paradigm shift where a new technology is rapidly adopted. Now, there are three ways to look at artificial intelligence, because it's making our information paradox much worse, of course. One, you might look at these, and these slides are from our head of technology, a guy called Ian Mulvaney. You might look at it something called as a stochastic parrot, something that just repeats what you say. So you put in a question to ChatGPT, it just repeats back to you what you were thinking anyway. I don't think it's that. Some people go to the other extreme and say this is the end of human civilization as we know it. It may or may not be. I'm not too sure that it isn't. But, you know, I think there is room to be concerned about AI. A more useful way to think about it is that there's something interesting going on here that might be helpful, and we should engage with it. And where we need to limit it and control it, we need to do that. But let's not disengage from it, but let's engage with AI to see what we can do better for patients. Now, when it comes to our world of producing content, because now, you know, authors can use AI to help them generate papers. We recognize the potential for benefit and harm, but we want transparency. So we want authors to be open about where they've used AI. We want them to, in a detailed way, to describe the AI they used and how they used it. But we will exercise our editorial judgment as to whether that was good or the right way to use AI or not. But we're continuing to learn, and we'll make mistakes. We have our own policy around this. And our policy essentially is that you have to be transparent, declare it, but a human has to take responsibility for the paper. It can't be a machine that takes responsibility. So AI cannot be an author. It can't be accountable for submitted work, and reviewers can't enter unpublished manuscripts into AI tools, into generative AI, ChatGPT, etc., to help them write reviews. We have a policy. Various other medical publishing organizations have policies. They're all broadly very, very similar. So I think actually artificial intelligence is a world. I mean, we're struggling anyway. I think it is the whirlwind capable of destroying everything in its path. It can't be tamed, but our one shot is to learn how to ride the whirlwind and direct that storm, because we are in not just an AI storm. AI is adding to a whole firestorm. Because in medical publishing, and I won't go into detail with all of these necessarily, but we're probably at our most precarious moment, because we have all the involvement of AI. We have open access publishing, which is good and bad. It allows people to publish, but it allows lots of stuff to be published very, very, very quickly without much scrutiny. We have lots of fraud, these things called paper mills, producing fraudulent papers. And we have the challenge to move from print to digital. So medical publishing has never been, medical journals have never been in a more precarious moment than it is now. Here's one example. Hindawi, they retracted 8,000 fraudulent papers in 1 year. Can you believe that? 8,000. I won't give you that detail. And Nature talked about predatory journals that are corrupting the open access model. They're just created to take your money. They don't scrutinize your paper, but just publish your paper. That's why they're predatory. And, you know, we're against predatory journals, and a lot of them actually make their money through public funding, because the public funds the researchers who then pay their money to these fake journals. So there's a problem here that needs fixing. So what does this mean for us? What does it mean? I think I'm going to be really boring now, which is that I think it means we need to think more about methodology over metrics. And if you're interested in exploring some of these issues in depth, which I won't do now, I recommend this paper to you. Two of our statisticians are authors on this paper, Richard Riley and Gary Collins, and they take you through very clearly in this table the problems that we find in research methods at the moment, from people focusing on how much to publish rather than the quality, how funders prioritize novelty over incremental and replication research, and the whole list is there.
but they also come up with how to do things better. So I recommend that to you, because there are ways to fight back and improve. And some of that is around better reporting, reducing waste, having reporting guidelines, and improving standards of reported research. Again, I commend that reference to you. But what needs to happen now? Well, I spoke about the manifesto before. This is what I think needs to happen now. We need to learn the lessons from the pandemic, such as how, as professionals and with professionals from other sectors, we learned together and created learning networks. We need to grasp the opportunity, which is a vast one, of real world data, large data sets, trusted research environments, because they can be transformative for all of us. We want patient involvement and public involvement from design to implementation. We want funding for public health and other types of methodologies and clinical research, not just prioritizing basic science. We want more equity in research design and analysis. We want a workforce strategy that allows the workforce to be involved with research, because science and research is important. We need to understand the climate impact of research. And I think we need a truth and reconciliation in evidence-based medicine, because there was a big row during the pandemic where people disagreed and there was a schism in evidence-based medicine, and we need to bring the evidence community back together. We need to understand the threats and opportunities of AI. And I think we need to reimagine academic medicine, and we're doing something on this, which is our Commission on the Future of Academic Medicine. Here it is. Miguel is one of the co-chairs of the whole commission's work. Deisy and our Latin American board will produce a paper to represent the problems and solutions for this region. So I'm very excited about that. I think it's an opportunity to revive academic medicine, redefine its role, so it's at the heart of our purpose to improve health and well-being outcomes, rather than serve academic careers and serve perverse incentives. So I think it's a very important piece of work. And there are 3 principles in my mind for journals to retain trust, because we're in a situation where trust is evaporating. We need to prioritize quality. So really have rigorous peer review processes. We need to have more diversity, new ideas, new methods. We need to embrace them. And we need to accept that we make mistakes, we get it wrong, and we need to correct the record and be willing to retract science that's fraudulent or flawed. So the whirlwind is here. It's all around us, but the way through it is a better world, thinking about a better world, one that prioritizes outcomes related to health and well-being for people and the planet. And I hope you will join us in that effort. I remind you of Doug's words: we need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. And a final thought, we are accountable too, as journalists and editors. And this is what I wrote in Editor's Choice in the BMJ. I think it seems a long time ago now, 2 years. There was outrage even then. In these days of outrage, it is still possible to find glimmers of hope. Where there is outrage, we attempt to bring solutions and hope. Those solutions require will and action. And that's where we fall short as a society. We want hope, society, I'm saying, wants hope without commitment, without effort. We see the evil only briefly. We hear it when it suits us, and we speak of it as if it is quickly gone. In these tumultuous times, a multi-crisis of climate, pandemic, and war, if you aren't feeling outrage and demanding action, you aren't paying attention. And I think that applies to all of us today. I think we're all activists in the same fight to create a better world for all of the people we care about and the planet we care about as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Para organizar a sessão, eu acho que seria melhor a gente deixar a sessão de debates para o final, após a segunda apresentação, e assim estendemos os comentários para os nossos debatedores e também para a audiência. Então, em sequência, eu gostaria de convidar Dr. Jocalyn Clark para fazer a segunda apresentação do Conselho Editorial. Obrigada.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you. Yeah, let's see, Kamran, if I can, this little guy needs to go down. I'll introduce myself while we're starting. Thank you. Yeah, it's fantastic to be here. I'm Jocalyn Clark. I'm the international editor of the BMJ. And I want to thank our hosts again, particularly Dr. Deisy Ventura and her team for hosting Kamran and I, and for convening such a wonderful meeting yesterday of our Regional Advisory Board for Latin America, and to thank all of you in this room for coming and your kind invitation to speak about the BMJ. So it's absolutely perfect that we'll take questions at the end, because my talk very much is going to build on what Kamran's described as the work and ambition of the journal. And what I'd like to do is take up, I'm going to need to ask for some help with the slide display, please. Oh, okay, here we are. Okay, there we are. We're flexible. So thank you again. And what I want to do, well, first let me introduce myself. I've rejoined the BMJ 2 years ago, having started my career at the BMJ in London 22 years ago. And at that time, I was in a training position that I think Kamran had held about 4 or 5 years before me. And at that time, he was my boss. And now I've come back to the BMJ, having gone to a number of other journals, including some of our major competitors. I was an executive editor at The Lancet for almost 7 years, just prior to coming back to the BMJ. So it's a great delight and pleasure for me to return to the BMJ, the place where I started my editorial career. And I am a Canadian national. I live in the UK and have lived and worked all over the world, but I am Canadian. I want to share with you some thinking around a very major trend that has shaped medical journals and medical publishing over the last 20 or so years of my career. And that's largely the rise of global health and the globalization of medical journals. So take you through some history and the place of medical journals within the world, the rise of global health, the big problem that we share that intersects these two growing trends and changing expectations for what we do as international medical journals. And that big problem, of course, is inequity. And then I want to come back to build on some of Kamran's remarks about the journal's ambition, to talk in particular about our international strategy and the work. And I very much hope that we can receive your feedback on that strategy, and also very much hope that you see yourself as having a place within the goals of our journal. So why do we care about journals? I thought you would find it interesting to know that the very first medical journal was published back in 1684. It was called Medicina Curiosa. It didn't last very long. But does anyone here notice something about the title of this journal and what its goals were back in 1684? Well, indeed. So in fact, the very first medical journal was a global medical journal, exactly consistent with what we're trying to achieve. And since then, enormous growth of the scientific publishing world and medical journals in particular. So some of your favorite medical journals and brand names, in fact, have been publishing continuously for about 200 years. That includes the New England Journal of Medicine and American Journal, The Lancet, which is just over 200 years old, and the BMJ, as Kamran said, we've been publishing since 1840. Since then, of course, there's been enormous growth. Perhaps the most disruptive, we might say, trend in medical publishing was the establishment of the Public Library of Science in 2004, a company that I worked for some time, that introduced the open access model to publishing. But since then, the growth of journals is almost undeterred, and there's now 30, perhaps 40,000 journals out there in the world for you to find a home for your work. The original function of journals was largely fourfold. First, to register your research or scientific work, particularly to allow you to establish primacy of your work. It served, as it does now in many respects, a kind of quality control exercise to certify your work. Of course, it's a way for the scientific community and health scholars to share and disseminate their work. and it also had the function of preservation, archiving the documentation. With the advent and rise of the internet, of course, a whole bunch of other functionality and platforms are available that ought to be replacing the function of journals. And yet journals persist. Why? Largely because of this last function of journals that has maintained an important place within our scientific enterprise, and that is the tying of evaluation of researchers in institutions such as the one we're standing in today to the assessment of their work. And that's often not the impetus of the journals themselves, but capitalizing on this publish or perish culture. Is this something that's familiar to you in Latin America as it is in North America, where I'm from, and in Europe, where we work? The publish or perish environment, this is how you advance in your academic career, of course ties journals to the very work that you're doing, such that it's often very well recognized that, you know, in many ways, the scientific article published in a journal is the only way that science is systematically represented in our world. But as Kamran was saying, and as the BMJ is very, very invested in, the role of journals can be much more than a repository for your work. And the BMJ in particular has an important mission, not just to be a documentation exercise, but to inform, to investigate. You'll often hear us as editors talk about speaking truth to power. It's our job to campaign and reform those broader institutions and to stimulate debate and set agendas. We like to see ourselves as an independent forum and a platform. And as I often say to my team, our job is to lead, not to follow. That greatly expands the role of journals. For the purposes of my talk and the ways that I'm going to argue, we have both an important place in generating inequity as well as a vital role in helping improve inequities, is to recognize that the global system of knowledge production is an ecosystem, that journals sit within a knowledge ecosystem that's highly, highly interdependent with academic institutions and with funders principally. So together we've generated a world in which both benefit and harm can generate. And I'm going to use this graphic that I've used for a very long time, that we produced back in about 2017 when I was at the Lancet, and we launched a large program of work that we called as shorthand Lancet Women. This was intended to advance women in science, medicine, and global health. And very importantly, it introduced the idea that we as journals were as much a part of the problem as other actors within this ecosystem, such that with funders and academic institutions, we were creating a cycle, a vicious cycle, that could make the contributions of women and other underrepresented groups invisible and perpetuating those inequities. So we couldn't, as a journal, sit outside this ecosystem and problematize the behaviors of other institutions, but to see ourselves as part of this problem. Of course, the flip side of this, which is the ambition, is to turn this vicious cycle into something more virtuous, such that if we give opportunities, taking responsibility as journals and editors, that we then create opportunities for more competition at the funding level, more visibility at the institutional level, and advancement and promotion, thus making those individuals more available and visible to journals and editors. So why global health? There's a lot of young people in this room, and I expect you're like many students and trainees around the world who have a growing interest in the field of global health. The growth in global health, particularly from the standpoint of journals and publishers, is probably the key trend that I have observed and been a part of over the course of my 22-year career. And I don't see that receding at all. And that's because the visibility of health problems around the world has very abundantly become more clear through media and the globalization of our economies. An explosion of scientific capacity and output from ostensibly developing or industrializing countries. China, for example, its scientific output now exceeds that of the US. There's an estimate that 50% of North American and European medical school and public health school programming, 50% of those programs include global health curriculum because of the demand of students. And a recognition that there's both a collective responsibility for the world's health problems and prominence on the world's political agenda. As a consequence of that, much greater coverage in medical journals, and of course, much more recognition of global markets for medical journals to be covering. There has been a massively changing geography of science by which almost every country in the world now is running a clinical trial. And whilst the absolute numbers of trials being done in some continents like Africa and Latin America are relatively small, they're absolutely growing with expectation that there will be growth there. Alongside and commensurate with that is a growing trend within research and scientific endeavor, which is the international collaboration. And this brings very many benefits to researchers, including the ability to generate more data as sites globalize, but also the ability to share resources and labor and to generate partnerships that we know can be so beneficial to answering research questions. They also happen to be more highly cited. And a global pandemic such as COVID-19, of course, turbocharged international collaborations, and I think we can expect that to continue. Naturally, over the course of this time, we have seen the rise of specialist journals in global health to meet these needs and demands and the growth of global health research. But I'd like to focus in particular on what we sometimes call the big five or the top five. These are the weekly big brand name medical journals, of which the BMJ, the Lancet, and PLOS Medicine, 3 journals that I've worked at on the left, largely based in Britain, and the 2 journals on the right, the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, I'm sure you've heard of them, based in the US, and have traditionally been very US focused and clinical journals, and yet over the last 7 to 10 years are rapidly globalizing not just their research pages, but also their editorial pages in starting to recognize and promote and cover issues to do with global health. The reason why these medical journals are so vital to understanding the role and responsibilities in global health of journals generally is that they are among the most influential media in the world. So often when you read your daily newspaper, for example, and there's a health or science story, the origin of that story is often one of these big medical journals that are extremely well covered by the press, circulate widely, publish continuously, and have impact far beyond the journal impact factor, which you'll be familiar with, but can influence discourses and agendas, practices, reputations. And crucially, as will have become clear, I think, from Kamran's presentation, these journals are more a mix of science and opinion than just a research product. They're often described as magazines, but we exist in a very competitive market. We are often competing for the same high impact, high quality science, and we're often competing for authors who have the most influence and authority in the world. They're edited by professional editors, that is, people like Kamran and myself and our large team who do this full time and for a living. And these are journals that are highly, highly selective, taking only a very small proportion of the work that's submitted to us, having to reject much, much worthy work, of course, simply because of the amount of competition we have for space. What's the problem? As we imagine the intersection of both global health and the globalization of medical journals is captured in this map. So this map depicts that classical inequity or divide whereby 90% of the world's resources for research are directed toward settings that represent just 10% of the world's global health burden, the 90-10 divide. But I think this map could also very easily show the divide between where publishing and publishers are located, which is largely in the global north, relative to where the health burden and much of the health workforce exists. This has led many observers and commentators to raise this sort of central contradiction, if you will, that global health is a discipline that is reproducing the very inequities that it claims to care about. And this has given rise, I think, to an incredibly important concept that has a lot of relevance for how we work as journals and editors. And that's the notion of epistemic injustice. Our colleague Shay Abimbola writes a great deal about epistemic injustice in relation to journals. But actually the origin of this term is in the work of a British philosopher called Miranda Fricker from 1999. And this is incredibly relevant for the work of journals because epistemic injustice happens when there is a discounting and indeed at times an exclusion of a knower based on his or her status and knowledge practices. And this is often seen as being at the heart of the exclusion of developing country or global south researchers within the pages of medical journals. Inequity runs through all of our work in medical journals and global health. And I want to dwell for a few minutes on one area of inequity that's extremely well documented through decades of research, partly because issues of gender have been well studied. And despite there now being over 50% of science undergraduates and medical students being women, at each stage of career, there's a drop-off in the numbers, representing a clear barrier to women advancing in their careers. That is not a fault that lies with individual women, because now we have evidence to show that there are deep gender inequities at a number of different areas: leadership opportunities, representation of women in leadership roles, in pay, promotion, publishing, and in the experience of sexual harassment, which is far, far greater for women than it is for men in medicine and the broader sciences. And I think one of the most important recognitions within this broader challenge of women's place within medicine and science and global health, and one that we were very clear about in my Lancet Women project, is that this is a structural problem. This is not a problem that is amenable to individual level interventions. But not only is this something baked into the institutions that form our structures, but that actually this system is itself constructed to maintain its position in order to reward the already privileged. And that's because there is no evidence of unequal ability between men and women, for example, or between people of color and the white majority. There's now lots of evidence of disparity and bias that exists within systems. There is an unequal playing field and a great deal of lack of equality of opportunity, such that advantages flow to certain individuals, often unearned, that compound over time. So that if you receive an advantage early in your career by having a leg up by virtue of your ethnicity or gender, that those advantages compound over time. And so the conclusion here is that we're not fixing women or people of color or other people who are underrepresented, but we ought to be fixing the system. This is important as we globalize our medical journals, because as many people, including my colleague and friend Madhu Pai, who's a fellow Canadian who does a great deal of work in this space, problematizing how global health has found a place within medical journals recognizes that actually what has fueled that growth, and unfortunately what has fueled what becomes visible and what is elevated as having status is fueled by power and privilege. The default settings in global health, Madhu says, are northern, white, and male. There's a lot we can do as medical journals, some of which is what we might call low-hanging fruits. There are things that we can do to immediately introduce changes within our workforce as journals. And at The Lancet, we met this challenge by not just immediately committing to a set of practices that we believed would help us implement commitments to gender equity and diversity, but set targets and monitored their targets so that our editorial advisory boards were at least 50% women. Of course, this is true also at the BMJ and our regional advisory boards, that peer reviewers would be 50% women, that in our commissions and series, we would have 50% women and 50% colleagues from low and middle income countries, and that our whole press operation would exercise positive action to ensure quotes were coming from women. And we incorporated those into performance measurement because you need to create incentives in a system in order for this to have any traction. Not enough to make promises and commitments. They need to have they need to have targets that people are accountable to. This, of course, was a time, as you might recall, before the pandemic, when the Me Too, the Time's Up, and other equity movements were asking not just of broader society, but of science and medicine to create more inclusion and equity. And many, many organizations around the world, perhaps your university and your journals in Latin America did the same, to make commitments about how we could improve equity, diversity, and inclusion. Unfortunately, just as these were taking hold, a global pandemic happened, which sadly worsened many inequities. And as I'm about to show you, actually made it very difficult for us to maintain our equity targets. First of all, as you may know, the pandemic, even in the first 8 to 12 months of the pandemic, about 2 million new scientific articles were added to the literature, the largest increase in history. This translated to a massive spike in submissions at all medical journals almost immediately after the pandemic happened. 2-3 times as many submissions at the journal. At the same time, a massive increase in pressure and expectations of journal editors. I think of it now as I reflect back on that time I was at The Lancet for those 2 years during the pandemic period, and I think of it now as an enormous privilege to have been there to help guide the public health response. But at the time, it didn't feel at all like a privilege. It felt like a catastrophe and totally overwhelming pressure and expectation. Not least because medical journals came under also increased scrutiny and attention. So all of a sudden, our audience wasn't just scientists and researchers like yourselves, but much broader, the public and media, some of whom may not have understood, the sort of codified language we use within science about different article types, et cetera. And, it was very easy to publish a small piece of correspondence or a small little editorial and find yourself on the cover of, the highest circulating newspaper in the country, often, misconstrued, et cetera. The public, of course, had an enormous appetite for an understanding and certainty about the pandemic, but it certainly made our work as journal editors very difficult. As Kamran said a few minutes ago, this was the first pre-printed epidemic. You will have lived through different Zika outbreaks in this part of the world, as I did in SARS when I was based in Canada, and didn't get the attention that COVID-19 did. But this created an enormous volume immediately of work, much of which was of low quality or wasn't going to be reproducible. So actually, very early on, researchers identified that there was a problem in how research was being generated and assessed, because much of it was being published, and that was going to relate to, or that was going to result in waste. Others have talked about the man-made tsunami of garbage science, which leads me to share a very strong feeling I had as an editor who was handling volumes of research. This is me, of course, at my home office under lockdown, leading actually at the time a section of commentary at The Lancet. And the research volume was bad enough, but actually, as you can probably remember, there was a time when all the researchers and scientists were, stuck at home when their labs or their operating theaters were closed, and everyone wanted to help. And so everyone had an opinion to share. And of course, they sent it to us. And that was very difficult. But actually, the primary author of those submissions looked a lot like the individual in this image. And what I'm trying to depict here by choosing this image is, this is a white man having his espresso after it looks like he's gone for a run with his iPhone. His house is spotless, so he probably managed to, still have time or have help around the house. But he was able to sit at his computer quite unencumbered, to write all those opinion pieces or to write up the pieces of research that he was able to quickly pivot to. And that this is a position of power and privilege. And it was one of the most immediate and devastating characteristics of the scientific endeavor around COVID-19 that became apparent. An immediate and sudden loss of productivity for professional or academic women, largely because of the disproportionate burden of domestic duties that had been placed upon them. So that included homeschooling the children if schools were closed, taking care of elders. Women describe having to also take care of their young trainees who were obviously struggling and suffering, as we all were, with how to deal with our lives during the pandemic. And this became obvious immediately through bibliometric analysis. And there was some journalism to share that this was happening. Very little in the way of remedies at the time. And it was clear shortly after the pandemic that in a report that the US National Academies of Medicine put out, having surveyed female academics across these disciplines, that 90% of them said that the burdens of that caretaking fell on their shoulders, and only 9% of them reported equally sharing such duties with their spouse, which is extraordinary given that most of these women were in partnerships with other professional men, many academics or medical. So one might have expected more egalitarian relationships. This led me during a kind of small sabbatical between my time at The Lancet and when I joined Kamran and his team at the BMJ, a fellowship that I received from the Brochet Foundation at the end of 2022 to reflect on what happened during the pandemic period and talk to a number of experts about what this meant now, because we were beginning to see some recovery of women's authorships in journals, but to reflect back on that 2 to 3 year period of time, it felt to me like we were under-recognizing the long-term harms of those publication credits, that recognition and visibility taken from women. So I invite you to look at those 3 papers that I've since published, 2 in the BMJ and 1 in the Lancet, in which I talk to experts and do my own data analysis to show that the pandemic publishing experience was a winning formula for men, largely white men. And we know that submissions, for example, across all areas of science, reduced to less than a quarter of women being corresponding authors, and that among the most prolific COVID authors, there were very, very largely men from high-income countries. This is important because of what others have documented in terms of unusual citation behavior of COVID papers. So at the time, COVID-related papers were receiving 20 times the citations of non-COVID papers during the pandemic period. And for those of you who are just beginning your careers in this academic world, Citations accrue into credit. Scientific capital. This is the lifeblood of your career. So to have not only been given the opportunity and the privilege of publishing a COVID paper, to then have your paper be turbocharged in the system in which we accrue capital is confers great advantage to some groups over others. This is true, of course, in media coverage as well, because those same women experts having that sudden loss of ability to participate in scientific life were not available to be in front of cameras. And it's very well documented that most of the experts on COVID, even those experts who weren't COVID experts, but became a COVID expert during the pandemic, that most of those folks in front of television cameras every single evening when you came home were men. That resulted in the silencing, as far as I'm concerned, of female expertise. It also then renormalized the male expert in an emergency, which is a very old and traditional and dated construction of leadership and expertise. And this is my concern. Of course, the people who were most marginalized, those women of color, women who had children, women who are in a precarious job situation, i.e. perhaps not permanent employment, were even further disempowered by this. Who else benefited other than men? I'm not going to dwell on this, but it would be remiss for me not to acknowledge that journals, of course, accrued scientific capital. And in this piece, I use the work of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, to use the notion of capital, which has both material and symbolic value, to show how journals themselves and editors accrued capital in that competitive marketplace, largely around impact factors, but also the scientific publishing business, which is already globally an enormously broad and profitable industry, with profits of the big scientific publishers, Elsevier, Springer Nature, and Wiley, having profit margins that far exceed Google, Amazon, etc. But what happened during the pandemic has largely gone unnoticed among academic researchers whose, of course, work and labor is being utilized in order to generate those profits. That the three largest science publishers had not quite double-digit growth during the pandemic, but their growth exceeded the forecast by double. So these are other groups that we have to be clear also accumulated capital during the pandemic. You'll be very curious to know that in terms of geography of COVID publications, I think we can expect that there was a predominance of publications in the big medical journals for sure, but more globally of institutions and researchers from the global north. But actually this has been very poorly studied to date. So if anyone is interested in doing that bibliometric work, I'd be very interested to see it. But the early signs are that there was an enormous output from China, of course, which is the epicenter of the outbreak individually, but that dropped off. And, if past performance is any indication of future, I think we can probably expect that there will be geographic inequities in what work was published in the big journals. Race and ethnicity, I have to tell you, from a bibliometric point of view, and for those of us like myself who are interested in tracking our performance as journals, much more difficult to study than sex or gender. And that's because, of course, we don't have international consensus or globally recognized definitions of race and ethnicity. Is very different in this country than in my country, etc. However, this is one very interesting piece of work that I suggest you have a look at by two colleagues. They happen to be from Toronto, where I'm from, Mustafa and Mohammed Abdallah, who used artificial intelligence and some some algorithmic capability to assign race and ethnicity to surnames of authors, a massive data set to show actually that there had been a growth at a certain point of time in these two major journals. I expect this would be true in our journal as well, but that has really stagnated. So you see in here the predominance of both white men and white men in particular in the pages of those major medical journals. The conclusion I drew from this project that I just want to mention briefly is that this is a problem of exclusion during a phenomenally important period of history that has major harms that are enduring. Many institutions, including my own academic institution in Toronto and in London at UCL, have these little quick fix things to help women recover their CVs or their promotion packages by having a like COVID impact statement where they give an explanation for why they dropped off the earth for 2 years. But this isn't enough because of the characteristics I've just described to you, which is the lack of visibility, the lack of those citation accruals, et cetera. And I believe that actually there will be longer term harms to not just women's careers, but the diversity of science and our future leaders. And that's because we know diversity among authorships, diversity among principal investigators, diversity on teams leads to different questions. And now we've had a removal for 2 years of those folks being around a table. Different levels of responsibility. I want to talk to you now for the last few minutes about what responsibilities journals have and what we're trying at the BMJ to do. So here's one sort of simple, again, it's kind of a cyclical thing that describes some of the roles and responsibilities we have as journals. And I deliberately put this in a cycle because I've seen it work where if you can create change in one aspect of this cycle, it can lift up others. So it has quite a cumulative kind of positive benefit. And equally, if you fail on some of these responsibilities, it can have a harmful benefit for subsequent cycles. One of the most important things that we can do as a journal is exercise positive action. In some contexts, that's called affirmative action. And that's a recognition that as editors, particularly in the non-research parts of our journals, that it exists within us an ability to choose to whom we go to commission content. And it's simply looking more broadly at the pool of talent and taking advantage of the diversity of expertise around the world. It's in no way lowering standards. In fact, it's improving our practice because we're not just going to the same old usual suspects, but actually looking more broadly, internationally, across gender, across race, ethnicity, et cetera. And it is possible, proved by the 6 or 7 years I spent at the Lancet leading a team that was responsible for commissioning 300 commentaries a year, which made us better with very little complaint, being able to take a section that was 3/4 authored by men to one where there's more gender balance. And we have the same performance at the BMJ. So we are exercising positive action, recognizing that if we take a passive approach, we're going to reproduce the inequities that currently exist. Reviewers, it's a little more difficult. So may I just tell you one thing, which is the issue around race and ethnicity and collection of data is difficult, except when an opportunity arises, which did just a year ago, where a group of publishers from around the world agreed that we would introduce into our submission systems a way for authors or reviewers to self-report their gender, their race, ethnicity. Voluntary, but this way it's more obviously reliable if you ask people to self-identify rather than assign it yourself or, take a extrapolation from geographic location, et cetera. So one area, I've only just seen these data late last week, but we have now an idea of how we're doing in terms of including a broader range of of authors and reviewers. And I think with reviewers, we've got a little bit of work to do. The second thing we can do is internationalize our content. So as Kamran was saying earlier, here in this top right little pie graph, this represents the sort of geography, if you will, of the BMJ reader to our website. It's very, very similar, in fact, to authorship. So we have a very large and stable authorship in the UK and in the US. Among our rest of world readers and users, which are about 1/3 of the world, most of them are in other high-income countries. And actually former colonies of Britain, interestingly enough, Canada, Australia, India, many parts of Western Europe. So the opportunity for us is to grow, particularly the little segment of our audience currently from low and middle income countries where, of course, the global majority work. This gives us enormous opportunity not only to highlight and cover your work, but also tap into much broader expertise. And this is the very core of our international strategy. I wish I could move this little guy here. Because I want to show you the most read editorials in the BMJ for last year. Thank you. Sorry about that. And actually, I just looked at these data the other day for the first time, and it's very pleasing to me as an internationalist, as I'm sure it is to Kamran, that actually are and forgive the typo, the top 10 most read editorials in the BMJ last year, many of them, the ones that I've colored in pink and orange, in fact, are global or international health topics. And I know many of you are working with Dr. Deisy on issues around the IHRs and the pandemic treaty negotiations. And I found it very, very interesting that the work that we published on that moving story, and of course, the importance of there being a pandemic accord to protect us in the future, were some of the most read in the journal. These are tens of thousands of readers each year. So yellow was the country-specific one. So I count it as international because it's Canada, but I think the pink ones are globally relevant. The orange one or the yellow one, Canada. What does that say there, Kamran? Is that the third most read last year? I wonder who wrote that editorial. Oh, in fact, he was my co-author, so he'll get credit for that too. We publish or perish as editors as well. Okay, so I've lost my ability to go forward. So that was number 2, internationalized content, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Require diversity and inclusion reporting. And I'm deliberate in my choice of verb require, because for most of my career, there's been an encouragement on the part of journal editors to have authors report their data disaggregated by sex or gender or ethnicity. And it's been proved over and over and over again that encouraging anyone to do anything leads to, less than a hoped standard. So actually, I would like to see journals have more bite to their requirements, recognizing that journals as gatekeepers are at the very end of a process. And actually, it's funders and ethics boards and institutions that need to ensure researchers both include and disaggregate data for men, women, and people of different ethnicities, such that when a paper is submitted to a journal, the ability to disaggregate and report appropriately is there. Fourthly, encourage equitable collaborations on authorship. As I said a few minutes ago, the present and future of research is international. And the best research, the most relevant research in the world, whether it's a trial or a survey, is done so across borders and in international collaboration. But there's often a lack of equity in how Global North researchers work with Global South researchers. And there is a way that journals and editors, I believe, can introduce the right leverage and incentive to to ensure that more equitable collaborations and authorship are there. There's no lack of standards. Many very good people have put together guidance for how people ought to be working together, with the idea of trying to eradicate outdated practices like helicopter research, or some people call it parachute research, where high-income country folks will come into a developing or global south country, extract the data, extract the local expertise, but then not share the credit and the authorship. So there's very good guidance for that happening. And some journals are beginning to actually require this. The BMJ currently is not among them, but it is one of my goals. I think this would be very easy for us to do, is to work in collaboration with other major journals that now say, if you want to publish global health research with us, you need to provide evidence. It's not for us to go look for that, but it's for you to prove from the very conception of your work that you undertook an equitable collaboration. And there's very standardized ways now for that to be produced. Of course, funders and institutions have a part to play in that as well. But really importantly, our work goes beyond what I described a few minutes ago as these sort of low-hanging fruits, which are the things we can do as editors to almost tick off our responsibilities to be more inclusive, to ensure what's coming to us meets a certain standard. But there's a much deeper, and I think more, in some ways, more destabilizing, if you will, exercise and ongoing education for us, particularly those of us who work in high-income countries that are wanting to be good advocates and stewards of global health and global health relationships. And the notion of critical allyship, which I expect many of you have heard of, is, in some ways kind of at risk of being a little bit of a buzzword to be a good ally. But actually allyship, as I understand it, and I'm taking it seriously as a global health editor, to engage in understanding the ways that I can be a supportive ally and not fall into the trap or the risks of what's described on the left-hand side of this slide, which is a sort of a form of allyship that can be called white saviorism versus the kind of allyship which is to work in solidarity, to concede space, to concede power. Again, my friend and colleague Madhu Pai does an excellent talk on this topic. But for those of you who are interested in allyship, and certainly the folks that I work with and are around me that I talk to about allyship, I believe can find useful something called the COIN model. And it's been so transformative for me that I always include it in my talks. It's conceived by a woman called Stephanie Nixon. She happens to be Canadian as well. But she's a very powerful scholar who really raises what is sort of an obvious point, which is allyship and talking about inequity is not just about focusing on the marginalized and the disadvantaged by our system, but is also about us recognizing our own power and privilege, and much of that advantage being unearned, because it's by virtue of place or birth or nationhood. And I find this very, very powerful way of looking at it. And consistent with that is a piece of work that we've done at the BMJ, and is an ongoing piece of work on decolonizing health and medicine. And I think of this as a form of allyship because it's a form of ownership of a problem. And it struck me when I left the Lancet to come back to the BMJ that actually the BMJ had done very, very little, if anything, on acknowledging and owning what these changing demands in the world of international and global health were having of us around reckoning with our colonial history as a publisher, as a journal of record, as participants in the broader world of global health. And this project is very special to me because I worked on it for many, many, many months before we launched it, because I felt like we needed not just to get on the bandwagon of decolonizing global health, which has become this kind of social media thing, but to actually understand how we could contribute to scholarship and action that's needed now. And in particular, and this is a very editorial stance, is to say what's missing, like what is not being talked about here? What do we need to raise that others have been afraid to do so? And that was the impetus for this piece of work. And this does a lot of things. And one of the things that I think is really spectacular, and I very much encourage you to have a listen and give us feedback, is this podcast series where we brought together and really centered experts at the leading edges of these issues to raise and problematize some issues that just don't get aired on social media when you talk about decolonizing global health, which is largely just criticizing institutions and journals and editors. We really wanted to look at like what's underneath people trying to pit a feminist agenda in health against a decolonial agenda, when in fact, many of the principles of those two movements are very much the same. And the roots of post-colonial thought are in Black feminist thought. Well, that is very inconvenient for the patriarchy who wants to pit us against each other, because then, we can't move forward on any of the agendas. And very, very importantly, in episode 5, which Kamran and colleagues from the British Medical Association joined, is what that means for us as a journal that is undoubtedly born of a colonial legacy and had for an association and an imperial aim, as other major journals like The Lancet had. Number 5, publish bravely and campaign for change. We heard about that in the previous talk. But in my last few minutes, when I talk about what we're doing at the BMJ and invite your feedback, one thing that I want to raise is that, as a major medical journal, all international strategies are not the same. You can create more international content and more opportunity for broader groups of people without being transformative. So what the BMJ's international strategy does is very explicitly acknowledge that whilst the world is more interdependent, and it makes a hell of a lot of sense for us, both editorially and commercially, to be more global, at the same time, a business as usual stance will just recreate inequities, which actually economically and socially and globally are increasing. That power is shifting, and that we need to also concede power in order to be effective. And that more than ever, and not least because of the pandemic, we recognize that there are heightened demands for social change that implicate elite institutions like journals, and that justice is central to that mission and vision that we have for the journal, to deliver health, to deliver well-being, to see ourselves in a planetary environment. And I hope, as is obvious from my remarks so far, that journals, because we are one part of that interdependent ecosystem, we're part of the problem, and therefore we have to be part of the solution. One mechanism in order to advance a progressive international strategy is to have regional advisory boards, and the last 2 days have been hosted by our co-chairs of the Latin America board. But we have boards now around the world that we're nurturing and growing and taking over time. And these folks who are experts and leaders in their regions are advising us about regional health strategies. And we're offering our platform as a way to advance your goals. So you define what that is. We offer a platform and the support in order to gain traction on those. We increasingly have editors around the world. Kamran mentioned that we have offices in China and India, but we have editors both in those locations and in America, but increasingly from around the world. And our editors are increasingly diverse in terms of their backgrounds. Collected content, those series, commissions that we've talked about, the COVID inquiries that we described, not just pieces of articles that come together to shine light on an issue, but crucially, from our point of view, can be a tool for accountability. Not just articles for your publication list, but a tool for accountability, raising questions that others can't, using the journal as a way to promote change within organizations. Some of these are in partnership with institutions or agencies. Others are initiated by us, but this is very much something that we'd like to nurture with all of you here. That includes the Health in Latin America page and project that we launched on July 23rd, which we're going to continue to promote over the year. And we kicked off that page, as Kamran said, with Deisy Ventura and her colleagues' series on Brazil, highlighting some ways that the G20 gathering and convening and the both political and media attention in this country on an economic agenda ought to be introducing health and sustainability and how it might do so. Finally, last slide. Of course, there are many, many challenges to doing what we want to do. And I expect and hope that we'll have an opportunity to talk together about what other challenges and feedback you might have. We are a major journal that has a broad audience and many, many goals across specialty, across union. Article publication charges, of course, remain a barrier for many people, but the BMJ has both a discount service and a waiver program. So we are trying to utilize that ability to create no barriers to any of you to publish in our journal. And of course, in 2024, a competitive environment, it's difficult to have visibility and reach, but we hope that working with you across regions and building relationships with many of you, that we can help to continue to make a difference in your region, and very much appreciate the opportunity to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. It's a very amazing speech, inspiring. Vamos então agora para a nossa parte final da sessão do seminário, com o esforço de honrar o compromisso de terminar ao meio-dia. Eu gostaria de convidar os nossos dois palestrantes para compor a mesa, e os 4 debatedores da sessão, lembrando a composição e já convidando para participar os editores associados da revista, Dr. Miguel e Deisy Ventura, e as professoras Marcia Couto e Aylene. Please sit here close to me. Vamos organizar da seguinte forma. Vamos abrir 5 minutos para comentários breves para cada um dos debatedores, com resposta aos nossos palestrantes, também com orientação para não estendermos mais do que 5 minutos, e reservar alguns minutos ao final para que a audiência, o público, possa fazer alguns comentários ou perguntas. Aqui na Faculdade de Saúde Pública, a gente tem uma etiqueta na composição de bancas de tese e doutorado, que é sempre começar pelo convidado mais distante. Então, convido o professor Miguel para começar.
Muchas gracias, muy bueno. No sé qué idioma. Estuvimos hablando largamente ayer sobre el uso del idioma relacionado con la descolonización. Shucks. Okay. So I have to speak English. But Português, muito malo. My name is Miguel. I'm Miguel O'Ryan. I'm a pediatrician, pediatric infectious disease specialist. I was invited, I still don't know exactly why, to participate in the international board of the BMJ. I can't remember how many, I think it was 6, 7 years ago. It seems forever. And I can tell you that when I first got there, I was the only one part of the Latin America. Well, also Dr. Montoya was Peru, but he was working in the US. And I sensed the feeling that there was a high interest of moving to a more international journal, but it was not yet completely clear how to do that. To make a long story short, I think there's been a significant boost during the past 6 years, especially during the past 2 or 3 years, in the BMJ to become a truly international, high-quality journal. And I think we've all seen that today. And I would take this, I don't know for you, but for me, this was really much more than about talking about the journal. It was talking about how we can increase our voices through high-impact journals in the world. And it's a challenge for us. And being very specific, the advisory group that has been now formed, where we have started working, I think is a great way to move forward, because our role is to convey the common work, thinking, thoughts from our continent and bring them to the journal so they can be shown. So we will be developing the structure of how to do that, but you can be set assured that that is the reason why I am currently the dean of the faculty of my faculty in Chile, of the University of Chile, a public university like this university. Very important. Why do we commit time, the little time we have to this? Because it's very important. It's very important. It has projection. I think it goes further away than our local activities. So that is the invitation to work together. That is what we're going to do with Deisy. We'll put all our efforts to make this happen. Thank you for the opportunity. I think that this is really, being redundant, a great opportunity for all of us. I am very enthusiastic about it because I've seen how it's happening. So thank you very much and ready to move forward. Gracias.
Gracias. Passo para os comentários da professora Marcia.
Nem sou tão longe, apenas do outro lado da rua. É um prazer estar aqui, agradeço em nome da Deisy e da Patrícia o convite. Eu acho que é uma grande oportunidade para a gente avançar na discussão sobre como democratizar, eu diria que seria essa palavra, a inserção dos pesquisadores e das publicações oriundas da América Latina num jornal de tão grande importância globalmente como o BMJ. Eu achei particularmente interessante as duas conferências, agradeço também enormemente e queria pontuar algumas coisas, pequenas provocações, né? Eu sou da Faculdade de Medicina há mais de 15 anos, professora e atualmente sou a chefe do departamento, mas eu venho de uma outra área de conhecimento que não a médica, eu sou antropóloga de formação. E me reconheço como feminista também. Então, a minha fala aqui é problematizar o quanto esse objetivo de alcançar a diversidade ele pode ser efetivamente cumprido, né? Ou trabalharmos para cumprir esse objetivo da diversidade enquanto as pessoas nas posições de poder e de privilégio efetivamente não se engajarem. E eu digo, né, é muito bom ouvi-la, né, como uma mulher professora e pesquisadora da área de gênero, falar sobre as imensas desigualdades na produção do conhecimento e na publicização do conhecimento nas revistas científicas. Mas quando os homens editores falarão sobre isso? E não apenas nós, mulheres, que parecemos que estamos defendendo o nosso pedaço. Quando efetivamente as outras populações minoritárias, né? Aqui no Brasil, a questão do racismo estrutural é extremamente impactante, e eu diria que é até mais impactante do que a desigualdade de gênero na produção do conhecimento e na publicização do conhecimento. Além de outras minorias, como as minorias de identidade de gênero, que são altamente relevantes e que são temas ainda muito pouco explorados, né? Então, eu acho que temos tido, sim, avanços muito importantes. Também como editora de algumas revistas brasileiras, como a Ciências Sociais, a Ciência e Saúde Coletiva e a Revista de Saúde Pública, mais recentemente, temos tido a preocupação de avançar nesses tópicos, né? Mas eu sinto essa dimensão como ainda muito refratária, mesmo aqui internamente e também fora, e sobretudo nos jornais de grande audiência. Uma outra questão que eu queria trazer para o debate é a questão da participação comunitária, né? Aquilo que a gente tem discutido bastante sobre a ciência cidadã, que investe numa participação ativa dos participantes de pesquisa em todas as etapas da produção de conhecimento, eu acredito que é um desafio cada vez maior, não só para nós enquanto pesquisadores, porque é difícil até para nós mesmos incorporarmos essa mudança de paradigma, né, de ver os participantes como aquilo que eram os ex-pacientes, né, e que agora são participantes, para uma perspectiva de integrá-los desde a composição do desenho das nossas pesquisas e, sobretudo, a escrita dos nossos resultados e a discussão que eles propõem em colaboração conosco. Então, eu acho que na sua fala, a dimensão dessa participação comunitária e desse investimento foi algo que me chamou bastante atenção e que eu acho que tem sido um desafio não só para nós pesquisadores, mas que será ainda um grande desafio posterior para as revistas, né? Seja no papel que temos cada um de nós, ou muitos de nós aqui, como revisores, como editores de revistas locais, mas também em termos das políticas editoriais das grandes revistas da área da saúde. Acho que eram esses dois temas para a gente aquecer o debate.
Muito bom. Márcia sempre nos provocando a pensar. Aylene, por favor.
Bom dia a todos que estão aqui e os que estão nos ouvindo remotamente. Foram muito interessantes as duas palestras, né? Eu acho que nos fazem pensar e, mais importante, que a gente olhe essas palestras também do ponto de vista nosso, né? Não do ponto de vista apenas como se a gente estivesse aqui só ouvindo o que vocês falaram e como é que a gente pode participar e propor alterações. Eu acho que a grande figura, eu gostei muito do seu mapa, né? O mapa com outra lógica, não vou dizer de cabeça para baixo, porque não seria isso, né? Inclusive, no Brasil, no português, a gente fala norte, né? Como a gente deve seguir. A gente não deve seguir para o norte, a gente deve ter uma ciência e um mundo que tenha várias dimensões, várias direções coordenadas para o norte, para o leste, para o oeste, né? Para todas as direções. Isso é muito, muito importante, né? E nesse sentido, né, a relação, né, não pode ser uma relação, como você colocou, do aliado, do ally e do salvador, do savior. Nós temos que estabelecer essas relações em pé de igualdade, né, porque o que nós fazemos, né, tem relevância científica, tem muita relevância. A nossa faculdade é uma faculdade de saúde pública, a gente trabalha no Brasil, a gente chama a nossa área de saúde coletiva, e ela é uma área que já avança há muitas décadas, né, numa combinação virtuosa entre a epidemiologia a política e gestão e as ciências sociais. Com isso, nós temos aqui metodologias muito fora do padrão do que é feito no norte global, e que nós temos dificuldades, às vezes, de colocar, porque elas, às vezes, são transgressoras, né? E isso a gente tem a oferecer, né? Então, acho que isso é muito importante a gente colocar isso, né? As outras questões que o Brasil tem também, né, eu acho que é importante, né? Nós temos tido movimentos de reconhecer essas desigualdades, né? Essas iniquidades presentes do racismo, né? E nós temos feito um movimento nas universidades brasileiras com as cotas, né? Que é você ter um percentual de vagas para a população preta, parda e indígena, né? Isso tem mudado as nossas universidades. Nossas universidades têm tido uma outra forma de olhar, uma outra forma de pensar e colocar outros problemas. Isso tem sido extremamente positivo. Mais recentemente, a gente tem conseguido colocar isso na pós-graduação, ou seja, pensar em mudar esse sistema, colocar novas, vamos pôr a palavra, novos problemas e novas posições que são relevantes para a ciência pensar, né? Com essas mudanças, né? Então, a gente tem tido, e também na Universidade de São Paulo e nas universidades federais, uma preocupação de também modificar a composição do nosso quadro docente em relação à raça, né? Então, isso é uma coisa muito importante. Recentemente, na área de saúde coletiva, nós também temos tido uma preocupação com as mulheres quando elas são cuidadoras, né? Exatamente para diminuir esse gap de a gente pagar o preço pela maternidade. As mulheres mais velhas aqui que estão na ciência, que tiveram filhos, sabemos o quanto nós sofremos com isso para estar aqui hoje. Então, as novas gerações não devem enfrentar esse problema e nós criamos mecanismos de valorizar e de apoiar as mulheres na forma de avaliá-las no processo de produção, entendendo, né, os primeiros anos importantes. A mulher ou o cuidador, né, quem seja com a criança até os 2 anos. São coisas importantes que o Brasil tem a colocar, né, numa relação mais igual, né, de troca, como a ciência pressupõe, né? Nesse sentido, eu acho que também é muito importante, vocês colocaram 3 coisas, né? Qualidade, diversidade e integridade, né? Eu acho que essa mudança, né, se a gente consegue realizá-la de igual para igual, eu fico muito feliz da gente ter um board da América Latina, ainda mais com a Deisy, nossa querida, né? Que foi uma das grandes porta-vozes de defesa da Covid. No Brasil, nós tivemos muitas mulheres, muitas, né, na verdade, protagonizando essa discussão, né? Então, acho que isso pode contribuir para melhorar a qualidade e a diversidade. E a diversidade não é só dos autores. É importante a diversidade de gênero, etnia, de localização, mas também é importante a diversidade do tipo de conhecimento, do tipo de objeto que é tratado. E umas coisas vêm atreladas a outras, isso é muito importante. A outra coisa que você colocou, que eu achei muito interessante, foi a abertura para a gente pensar os profissionais não médicos, né, especialmente áreas rurais. E aí o Brasil tem uma experiência que praticamente nenhum outro país tem. Nós temos hoje quase 300 mil agentes comunitários de saúde, num sistema universal construído na periferia do capitalismo, com todas as dificuldades. Ou seja, nós temos muito para falar para o mundo, muitas experiências a colocar, né? E acho que nós precisamos e devemos ser ouvidos, e isso vai melhorar realmente, né, as 2 coisas que a gente precisa, que é saúde e bem-estar, perseguindo num mundo menos desigual. Era isso.
Obrigada, professora Aylene. Passo, então, para a professora Deisy Ventura, nossa colega na faculdade, e que muito nos honra em compor o comitê, o boarding regional do BMJ.
Bom dia a todas e todos. Minha fala será mais uma fala de agradecimento, porque essa é a única etapa pública dessa longa agenda que nós estamos fazendo com os nossos convidados. Eu queria começar por dizer que a minha postura ideológica de falar em português na minha escola e de não falar inglês ela só é uma atitude política possível graças à extraordinária equipe que nós temos aqui. Vejo Isabela, Leandro, Paulinho, Pamela, não quero esquecer Adriana Salai, e não está aqui Jameson Martins, que nos acompanhou desde o início do trabalho no Conselho como intérprete e, infelizmente, ficou doente nesse momento de encontro presencial. Luísa Witzel Farias, que eu não vejo aqui. Se eu esqueci alguém, vai me perdoar, mas esses pós-doutorandos, doutorandos, mestrandos, graduandos que nos apoiam, eles tornam possível, com a sua generosidade e com o seu compromisso político, que esses eventos sejam realizados numa universidade pública que tem poucos recursos, e o trabalho deles torna tudo isso possível. E quero destacar especialmente o papel da Adriana Salai Oliveira, que nos recebeu ontem na ocupação Jardim Julieta e, em seguida, nos mostrou o projeto Quebrada Alimentada no restaurante Mocotó, que tem um engajamento extraordinário, absolutamente voluntário, com todo esse trabalho que a gente vem realizando. Mas quero agradecer também às nossas intérpretes, que são absolutamente extraordinárias. Realmente há diferenças importantes nos trabalhos de interpretação, vocês são fantásticas. Muito obrigada. Da equipe, eu quero passar ao agradecimento às minhas colegas, que desde o primeiro momento em que eu propus que nós recebêssemos a reunião do Conselho Editorial, a primeira reunião presencial do primeiro Conselho Editorial do BMJ para a América Latina, apoiaram imediatamente essa iniciativa. A professora Patrícia Jaime, vice-diretora da nossa faculdade, a professora Marcia Couto, chefe do Departamento de Medicina Preventiva da Faculdade de Medicina, a professora Aylene Bousquat, que não somente é presidente da nossa comissão de pós-graduação, mas também membro da coordenação da área da saúde coletiva na CAPES do Ministério da Educação, professora Gabriela de Júlio, minha parceira na coordenação do doutorado em Saúde Global, e também o professor José Ricardo Aires, que não está aqui, mas que, através do Observatório das Instituições Brasileiras, também apoiou esse evento. E quero agradecer aos funcionários da nossa faculdade que nos apoiaram, na pessoa do Adolfo e do Júnior, que provavelmente nos ouvem porque acompanham a transmissão pelo setor de tecnologia de informação. Com os recursos materiais limitados que nós temos, eles fazem o impossível e nós somos muito gratos. E, obviamente, concluo agradecendo aos nossos convidados. Professor Pedro Can é o Drauzio Varela, da Argentina. Drauzio Varela é um grande comunicador brasileiro que esteve na luta da resposta contra o HIV/AIDS, esteve na luta da resposta contra a Covid-19 e, como nós, também foi atacado, ameaçado. Até hoje, nós pagamos o preço da defesa da ciência. É uma honra tê-lo aqui, professor. A professora Mercedes Colomar estava até pouco tempo aqui, veio de Montevidéu, é uma jovem talentosa que trabalha sobre saúde materna e nos prestigiou durante todo o evento. O professor Júlio Croda esteve conosco até ontem à noite, teve uma participação muito importante na reunião do Conselho Editorial. E, claro, meu companheiro, co-chair, professor Miguel O'Ryan, que acredito que compartilha comigo esse entusiasmo, mas também a responsabilidade que nós temos de aproveitar essa oportunidade. Estamos juntos nisso e agradeço muito a sua presença e essa parceria. E, claro, evidentemente, os nossos editores, que acho que só o gesto de convidarem para fazer parte do Conselho Editorial uma advogada da área da saúde, né, com posições bastante fortes no que se refere à agenda da saúde global, mostram uma abertura, essa abertura que nós tentamos aproveitar e ampliar, mas que tem um convívio muito generoso conosco. Eu quero agradecer muito. Jocalyn e eu tivemos muitas reuniões, algumas também com Kamran e com Miguel. Há muito trabalho por trás dessas decisões de abrir caminhos, né? E queria reconhecer muito e vir de tão longe para estar presencialmente conosco. Foi muito generoso, nos emociona e, com certeza, sempre serão muito bem-vindos para estar conosco de todas as formas. E eu queria terminar dizendo que tem uma relação, o que eu vou dizer, com o que tanto Kamran como Jocalyn falaram sobre evidências científicas. Kamran mencionou o artigo muito importante que ele escreveu sobre o assassinato social, né, social murder. E nós tivemos muita dificuldade durante a pandemia de Covid-19 no Brasil em dizer que estavam sendo cometidos crimes no Brasil, que esses crimes eram crimes de direito comum, crimes contra a saúde pública, como disseminar epidemia, como charlatanismo, como infrações a recomendações sanitárias, mas também crimes contra a humanidade, porque nós considerávamos que nós consideramos até hoje que o Estatuto de Roma, que criou o Tribunal Penal Internacional e tipificou uma série de crimes internacionais, correspondia, no artigo 7º, letra K, ao que nós chamamos de tratamentos desumanos, que era a decisão do governo federal de espalhar a Covid-19 no Brasil. Mas nós temos evidências disso, não era uma opinião nem uma atitude política. Nós tínhamos a tal ponto evidências que o nosso estudo inspirou a Comissão Parlamentar de Inquérito do Senado Federal sobre a Covid-19. E essa Comissão Parlamentar de Inquérito concluiu que as autoridades, inclusive os ministros da Saúde do período, eram responsáveis, haviam praticado esses crimes. Esses processos estão paralisados em razão de uma decisão política da alta cúpula do Ministério Público no Brasil, que, por enquanto, não deu andamento aos processos. Mas essas autoridades que atuaram na Comissão Parlamentar de Inquérito concluíram pelo indiciamento, pela responsabilização dessas pessoas. Do ponto de vista jurídico, nós temos todas as evidências, nós temos as provas, e é uma razão política que não faz avançar. Mas como são evidências de uma natureza diferente e como publicar expressões como crimes tem um custo político alto, poucas revistas, tanto brasileiras como estrangeiras, tiveram coragem de usar essa palavra. E em outubro de 2021, o BMJ publicou o nosso artigo, que se chama Crimes contra a Humanidade na Resposta à Covid no Brasil, lições para todos nós. Então, também por isso, quero agradecer a vocês. Se trata justamente de como interpretar o que é evidência e o que não é evidência. E, nesse artigo, estava linkado a versão integral do nosso relatório em inglês. Então, todas as pessoas que tiveram abertura de espírito para reconhecer essas evidências tinham ali a oportunidade de ter acesso a todas as provas que estavam linkadas numa revista de grande impacto. E, claro, quero agradecer a todos que estão aqui, que vieram participar dessa atividade e quem nos acompanha pela internet, que estão, na verdade, ao demonstrar seu interesse, nos ajudando a abrir esse caminho de pautar a descolonização da saúde global, que não é um assunto só dos nossos convidados estrangeiros, é um assunto nosso, porque nós, muitas vezes, como brasileiros, reproduzimos esses comportamentos em relação aos nossos colegas da América Latina, da Ásia, da África, e porque, às vezes, repetimos esse comportamento, inclusive, entre nós, sem questionar as nossas práticas que podem causar tanto sofrimento e deixar de trazer para o mundo científico uma contribuição que é muito valiosa dos saberes que não foram ungidos pelos privilégios que diversos de nós temos, e me sinto particularmente feliz porque até alguns anos atrás eu ficava constrangida de usar esse aparelho num evento com interpretação, e hoje eu me sinto muito à vontade e muito feliz, e quero que os nossos alunos se sintam assim, muito à vontade e muito feliz por ter um radinho desses e ouvir uma excelente tradução do que foi dito e poder falar também na nossa língua, que em grande parte nos define. Muito obrigada.
Excelente, Deisy. Muito obrigada. Recentemente eu li um artigo que mapeava as dificuldades dos pesquisadores do Sul Global para inserção. E o tempo gasto na preparação de cada uma das atividades, seja comunicação num congresso científico, a escrita de um artigo, o tempo dispendido para se expressar e apresentar o seu conhecimento numa outra língua é absolutamente maior do que na sua própria língua. A nossa língua nos define. E quando a gente tem tanta tecnologia sendo incorporada na ciência, é inadmissível pensar que essa tecnologia também não possa ser incorporada para facilitar a comunicação entre todos nós, né? Professor, passo para você.
Thank you very much. You've inspired me. I think I'm going to speak in my language, which is Urdu. Do we have translation services available? Shall I start? No. Okay. No, but I'm very proud of you for saying that. I think you should be proud of your language and your culture. I think that's what we stand for at the BMJ. I'm going to keep this relatively short because there are a few things, just a few key points to say. Number one, I agree with all the points you've made. You know, we've talked a lot here, Justin and I. I mean, the test is changing something, you know, making change happen. And I believe one of the ways to do that is to have a fair and equitable view of the world, but then find people who are better than you at making that happen, people who understand the particular problems of any country or region better than you, and giving them the power to make that change happen. So that's why we're here. This is not an exercise in some kind of publicity or marketing, okay? We don't need to be here. We're absolutely genuinely here to say to you, we want to change the nature of what we do. And we do that not by us saying this is what we should now be doing. It's by empowering Deisy, Miguel, all the colleagues on the Latin American editorial board, all of you, to change the nature of what we publish in the BMJ. So that's what this is about. And I hope you will take that opportunity, because as we've shown, as we know, that graphic really shows, the world of medical publishing, medical science and healthcare as a result is full of bias. And two of the most important biases are geographic bias. One, you know, where you work and where you're employed. There are data around this. And secondly, there's a big bias around language. And as I was saying to colleagues yesterday, 20 years ago, I wrote an editorial that actually the biggest barrier is language. But as you were saying, that should no longer be a barrier with technology. So we must together work out how we fix that without reinforcing the colonial, the top-down, the rich view of the world. And so it's a delicate path to tread, but we must tread it together. The second thing I want to say is that the world order has failed, okay? You know, we've had an experiment where rich countries, the US and Europe, have tried to create a better world. They've spectacularly failed to do so. I think many of us think it's time for the people who really care about this world to take control of it. And that means the people of Latin America, the people of Africa, who have been harmed, disadvantaged, exploited for centuries, to take leadership of this planet. And I hope Brazil will take that opportunity when in chairing the G20. So I think we need to, the world order needs to change. It's time for a new world order. And we want to play our parts at the BMJ in making that happen. So from our perspective, it's genuine. We haven't got all the solutions. We don't have all the answers, I'll be honest with you, which is why, as I said, we want people who are better than us to come up with the answers, and that's all of you. And I think working together, we can work through those. So I hope you will support us. It's been an absolute privilege to be here. It's really humbling to be here in this absolutely fantastic environment, to be hosted so hospitably and warmly by all of you and by all our colleagues. And we're very grateful to you, and we appreciate it very much. And we hope that you will now, take this forward and really change what we do. Because the problem we face is, I gave you those examples, I hope, if you remember them, about what we do involving patients, what we do around evidence and science, what we do around competing interests. The problem we have is other journals do not follow us. The Lancet, does also very good work, as Jocalyn gave many good examples. But I would say outside those two journals, we're in a very difficult position because the rest of the landscape of medical journals does not want to change. But we want to effect that change. And I think by us changing and showing how that change can be successful will help change the world that we work and operate in, and ultimately do the thing that we care about, which is improve the lives of the people that we work with, that we live with, and the countries that we live in and the planet that we inhabit. So do take this seriously, and thank you once again for the opportunity here today.
Thank you. Dr. Jocalyn, please.
Thank you. I'm just going to make two remarks. Well, first, I would like to endorse everything that Kamran said about our intentionality, and certainly about the gratitude that I feel to be hosted and to spend time with all of you. And he chose two words that are very much in the forefront of my mind. And to respond to you in particular, Deisy, that it is a great privilege for us to be here. I'm very, very touched by all of the things that were said on the panel in reaction to us sharing with you our aspirations and our intentions for the journal. But also very, very inspired by what I would describe as the special, perhaps Brazilian, but maybe more broadly, the special Latin American sauce. And I will tell you that the advisory board and all of you here and everyone that we've encountered over the last couple of days, you bring something so unusual and unique in the world. And forgive me for telling you, observing something that you already know about yourselves. But it's the passion and the political consciousness in relation to health that is both incredibly instructive to Kamran and I and the work we're trying to do, but it's also very challenging. And so I would like to just add to those words of gratitude to how you're enriching, by your comments, enriching how we decided to construct our presentations, how you've enriched what I'm going to be thinking about by saying how appreciated it is that you are challenging to the world that has defined what global health is, to obviously your political leaders who have decided how they wish to organize your societies and your health systems, but to us as individuals who are now, colleagues and partners of yours. So to continue to challenge what we're doing and to question the sort of things that we are placing in front of you, it's incredibly valuable. And as I said, I think quite distinctive among, the sort of cultures and training that many of you evidently have experienced. So that's very appreciated. The second remark I wish to make is around, I suppose I would call it like changing the system, because in many ways, what we as individuals hope to contribute to are sort of, in many ways, feel very small, and they're those low-hanging fruits that I described. And I'm not sure that totally translates from English, but it's like the things at the bottom that are kind of easy to pick off. And things like, you know, being able to generate change within your immediate environment, those things are important and necessary, and you must use your voice and your fearlessness in order to do that. But they're certainly not sufficient to create change. So just to respond to your point about the extent to which we fight for gender equality within an environment and systems of power that are so resistant to change. I mean, two things. I really feel that when you describe that. It's why it's so important that we continue to focus on fixing systems rather than fixing individuals operating within those systems. And that's going to require like complete structural overhaul. I always say, because I work with a lot of sort of organizations that are trying to push, and I should say intersectional gender equality and intersectional feminism, which recognizes axes of inequality across race, ethnicity, as well as gender. But that really all of these resources that we put toward leadership training for women, really, we should just be putting all that money into trying to change men, because that, you know, systems won't change until there's a recognition of our whole system needs to change. So one way of thinking about that is like institutional leadership. You know, the Miguels, the Kamrans, the others in the world who can become vectors of change, as undoubtedly I believe they are. But the other is to just completely change how the whole thing is organized. And that includes our health system and our workforce and the way that we value work. I mean, most of the time, that equation disadvantages women versus and advantages men. So this is a complete system change. So I don't think it's understated, and I don't think it's in any way a fight that we'll not continue to have just because we feel like we're talking to ourselves and that the change is small and incremental. I think we need to transform utterly how, you know, both social and professional life are organized. And in that SDG framework that Kamran put up on the board and is meant to sort of organize our national government's collective responsibilities, that actually a very, very key determinant of health and well-being are the gendered norms within our societies that decide what work or what lives are more valuable than others. And of course, Indigenous women, women of color, women with disabilities, et cetera, are at the bottom of that ladder. So the response to your remarks is just simply to appreciate so much you raising the complexities of that, enriching my thinking around it, but also very much to say we're not going to stop fighting for it. And we're not going to take the simple path to understanding what social justice in health looks like. We're going to name the problem, and we're not going to, you know, we're not going to be distracted because we see the problem, and the problem is the system that's imbued with the power and privilege that doesn't serve any of us.
Thank you. Temos alguns poucos minutos de final da sessão, então abro o microfone para a plateia, para intervenções bem curtas, até 3, por favor.
Bom dia, quase boa tarde, todas e todos. Estou nervoso, emocionado, mas aí a tradução ajuda. Eu não sei se eu já falei meu nome, eu sou o Paulo, eu venho das relações internacionais, e estou fazendo uma tese aqui no Programa de Saúde Global e Sustentabilidade sobre o movimento de descolonização da saúde global. Aí tive a oportunidade de participar ontem da programação do Conselho Consultivo, né, regional, e da programação de hoje à tarde eu participar também, está sendo muito enriquecedora. O meu primeiro artigo de tese vai ser sobre quem era o editor do BMJ Global Health até poucos meses, o Saia Bimbola, que foi citado aí nas apresentações. Mas aí eu queria aproveitar para fazer uma pergunta, uma e meia, talvez duas, e aí eu vou linkar, que eu fui muito contemplado pelas falas das professoras Márcia e Aylene, começando pelo ponto, você mencionou a democratização, né? Eu acho que descolonização é uma palavra que está com um apelo internacional muito forte nesse meio da saúde global, mas eu considero democratização uma palavra tão forte quanto, principalmente no contexto latino-americano, mas no Ocidente como um todo hoje em dia. E aí, considerando isso, eu queria aprofundar um ponto que a gente começou a discutir ontem, o Conselho começou a discutir ontem, sobre parcerias que o BMJ poderia fazer com periódicos locais. E aí eu queria só ressaltar a diferença de modelo mesmo, que eu acho que é importante levar em consideração, do modelo comercial e de negócios do BMJ para o modelo majoritariamente público brasileiro. Acho que é um desafio importante pensar como isso se daria em parcerias. Não me fecho a essas parcerias, pessoalmente falando. Acho que elas podem fortalecer o sistema público brasileiro, mas acho importante considerar. E aí, passando já para a segunda, acho que estou sendo rápido, a professora Aylene mencionou a questão do norte, sul, leste, oeste, né? Eu acho que nessa coisa do sul global, norte global, a gente tem perdido de vista a velha dicotomia ocidente-oriente, né? Ela é tomada como defasada, uma época que já passou. Mas aí, pegando o gancho dessa minha primeira pergunta, de modelos público-privado, eu fiquei curioso de ouvir mais do Kamran e da Jocalyn sobre o papel do Oriente no mundo acadêmico, de publicação acadêmica científica contemporânea, né? Vocês mencionaram que o BMJ tem um escritório na China. Eu tenho visto notícias uma atrás da outra sobre a China estar batendo recordes de publicação aí, superando muitas vezes o próprio Ocidente, né? Então, enfim, é uma forma de provocar vocês, de se o lugar de fala de vocês está sendo pressionado de alguma forma por esse movimento geopolítico. E acho que é importante, enfim, a gente como latino-americano pensar nesse tipo de coisa também. Obrigado.
Mais alguma pergunta da audiência? Acho que temos uma aqui, né? Vou pegar meus óculos. A gente tem uma pergunta que vem do YouTube. Excelentes palestras. Gostaria de perguntar aos editores se todas as estratégias de promoção de equidade apresentadas hoje geraram mudanças nos percentuais de artigos aceitos para revisão. Would you like to repeat? Yeah. Gostaria de perguntar aos editores se todas as estratégias de promoção de equidade apresentadas hoje geraram mudanças nos percentuais de artigos aceitos para revisão. Alguma mais? Então, encerro e passo a palavra para finalização.
Thank you. My age, it's quite difficult to remember the questions when there's more than one. Let me just answer your question first. Thank you for joining us yesterday and for asking a question again. It was really appreciated. I mean, I think you talked about democratization, and you talked about it. I think it's very important. And I would, we've just had a previous commission on you've heard of the National Health Service in the UK, which is a sort of public service funded through general taxation. And one of the action points that we're taking on with that commission is how to get civil society involved in setting health service priorities. So, I mean, one of the things that we say is unarguable in the UK is that it's, you get the care you need free. You get that care, and that's something that we have. But of course, that means that your costs keep going up. And so we're arguing that there should be a very active conversation, something called a citizens' assembly, possibly. Perhaps you have those here, where citizens are involved in thinking through the choices and the trade-offs and helping politicians decide on the long-term trajectory. So I very much support those notions. I think the more civil and public involvement we have in the direction of healthcare and other services that sectors that relate to health, I think is very, very important. So thank you for asking that question. On the point about East and West, I'm not quite sure what you meant about pressure. I mean, I don't do pressure. You know, people can try and pressure me as much as they want, but I do what I think is the right thing. Okay. I mean, if we talk about you talk about the East, let's talk about India, South Asia, and China. There is a vast difference, for example, between those two countries. Well, China country, South Asia being a region. They might be equivalent in terms of population, but China is producing a lot of research, has a very sophisticated kind of structure to support that research, has the money and the organization to really advance its research enterprise, which is why it's accelerated the research output so rapidly. Whereas India, I was saying yesterday to colleagues, they've had a rapid expansion in medical schools. So now there are hundreds of medical schools, lots of them are private medical schools. But the chair of our South Asia editorial board, somebody called Samir Anandi, he did an analysis of the research output from medical schools in India, and it was hardly anything. You know, it's kind of non-existent. So when it comes to science, the two regions, I mean, China's not a region, but you get my point, that they're in a very, very different place. I mean, if we are to be a global journal, international journal, we have to be in the places where people are publishing. So that's why we engage with China and South Asia. That's why I want to work here with all of you in Latin America. And different places have different complications, as you can imagine. So it's very interesting. I think you're right. I mean, you can carve up the world in many different ways, East and West, North and South. I mean, probably the way I would look at it is to think, I mean, you know, advantage and disadvantage, you know, in terms of income, it's probably one good way of doing it. And that is not strictly North and South or East and West. And we need to acknowledge that. The final question, which was on there, yeah, which is about whether we've shown any progress. We do have measures, we do have metrics that we adhere to, and perhaps Jocalyn is closer to some of the actual numbers than I am. But I think there is evidence, as Jocalyn showed when it came to editorials, that we make progress. You know, what we do at the BMJ is that we agree what the strategy. Let's take the international strategy, which Jocalyn is leading on. We agree what that strategy is, and then we put it into the objectives of our editorial team. That these are it's a bit like your quotas that you talked about. I think you talked about quotas. You know, this is what we want to do. These are the proportion of papers we want from outside, you know, the UK, the US, the rest of the world, from poorer countries, and these are the number of proportion of women authors we want, and versus men authoring papers. So we do have those sorts of metrics that we put into people's objectives, and it's not easy, right? Because you might want to commission articles from you know, people who are diverse, but for the reasons Jocalyn pointed out, those people are probably disadvantaged in their time, in being time poor, having the opportunity to take up that invitation. So that doesn't stop us trying, but it makes it difficult for us to get to point where we want to get to very quickly. So we have to keep pushing at it, and we have to keep pushing at the ecosystem we work in to try and change it. I'll give you one example. It was our conference last week. I was asked to open, I was opening the session on the second day with the keynote speaker. And as people might realize, I only look at what I'm doing almost the day before I do it. And when I looked at the panel, it was all men. And I said, we can't have this. I'm not appearing on this panel if it's all men. And that caused a big problem, but they changed it. They changed it. So we're not perfect. We haven't got to where we want to get to, but we are making progress. And perhaps, Justin, you might be able to outline some of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take, thank you, Paolo. It's been wonderful to get to know you, and I'm really looking forward to your thesis. Yeah, I'll just expand a bit on Kamran's comments on the second question, and then come, if I may, to a bit of your first question. I mean, I think the issue around generating better diversity and inclusion, which we hope then generates better equity in our, like the bit we can control as editors. You know, we need to do two things, is not just say we're going to do things, but actually create some accountability mechanisms. And that can be things like, you know, baking it into people's performance measurement or their objectives, or doing the monitoring and tracking that we do. And on the basis of that, both at the Lancet and the BMJ, I've seen, to answer the question of our colleague on the live stream, I've seen progress, particularly around gender within authorships, reviewers, and our editorial advisors. And that's because as editors, you get to choose. And so because there's such an enormous pool of talent of women around the world that have been underutilized, it's quite easy often to find those people. The trick is that when it comes to like things like series or articles that we commission, the trick is you need to have a woman lead author and then allow her to assemble a team. Because if you go, in my experience, go to, you know, the very established senior male author and just ask them to produce a gender balanced or an ethnically diverse team, they may not be able to accomplish that. But if you allow the leadership to be invested in that sort of early career or underutilized woman author, that, in my experience, so that's one of the tips I give my team. But I want to reflect slightly different on the question, and I know Kamran agrees with me very much on this point, which is a sort of a decolonial approach to how we generate expert advice about what we publish. And that's really, I must say, a very non-negotiable standard that if a piece of research comes to us from Buenos Aires and it's done in, you know, the suburbs or the slums or some setting within that country, or sorry, that setting, that the reviewers that we ask to assess the work in order to help us editors take good decisions, that those folks have the relevant local expertise. And I know that probably sounds very obvious to you, but actually the tradition of medical journals, as they've internationalized, I've observed many, many times, and still do, to be honest, because as Kamran says, it's not perfect, but the tradition has been to continue to rely on the dengue expert at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, even though he or she may have never lived or worked in Bangladesh, where the trial has been conducted and has been submitted to the BMJ. So that, to me, in the context of what we're talking about today in our international strategy, that's a more important commitment that we need to ensure happens. And you know what happens in that regard? You start utilizing a broader pool of experts as reviewers, as editorial advisors, then you begin to build out your community much wider. And you know how networks are, they just snowball. So then those folks would then be converted, we hope, to authors and other contributors to the journal. So that's super, super important. The only thing I want to say, Paolo, about your first question is a couple of things. One, I think in global health, we have a tendency to chase fashions, like buzzwords, hashtags, movements, and sometimes they can be a little superficial. And of course, this is fueled by social media. But So sometimes I feel like we chase things and divisions that are unnecessarily like semantic or shallow. And sometimes we lack the depth and attention to, you know, the epistemic or the deeper meaning of things and what actually, you know, we need to do in order to create change. So one of the things I want to emphasize is that, you know, the system in which we live and even the geopolitical distribution of power, this is all made up. It's a construction. And so actually, when you said your question, I felt this joy inside of me, which was, wow, like this world is crazy, but what a time to be alive. To see how the world is changing, but if all of it is a construction, what does that mean? That means we can change it. We can just make a different construction. You know, it's just made up that, you know, informal work or caretaking work is less valuable than professional work. You know, it's a made up thing that women leaders should be more compassionate and empathetic and like nicer to their staff than a man leader. But actually, it would benefit all of us if men leaders could completely express themselves in the whole of their, you know, humanity, and that women could express and be themselves in the whole of the things that they would like to be in order to, you know, execute their leadership. So the thing I just want to emphasize to you, and particularly since you're doing your graduate studies, is that it's a construction to say decolonizing health is a certain thing, and that the challenges in front of us, which of course are substantial, they're not real in a way, and so we can reimagine them in order to, you know, produce something that looks very different to what we have now.
Thank you. Excelente, muito obrigada pela presença de vocês, por essa manhã de tanta reflexão, de tanta partilha, de tanto aprendizado. Quero, de antemão, trazer um convite para que voltem à Faculdade de Saúde Pública. Essa é uma casa da saúde pública brasileira. Isso, providenciaremos. A tecnologia irá nos ajudar na língua de cada um, dependendo dos recursos disponíveis. Agradeço a todos vocês pela presença, e seja presencialmente ou virtualmente. Muito obrigada, bom almoço para todos.